Lesson 7, Using Functions and Objects. In Lesson 7, you'll learn about two more key JavaScript concepts. First, you'll learn the details of using functions, which enable you to group any number of statements into a block. This is useful for repeating sections of code, and you can also create functions that accept parameters and return values for later use. Whereas functions enable you to group sections of code, objects enable you to group data. You can use them to combine related data items and functions for working with the data. The topics we will cover in Lesson 7 are using functions, introducing objects, using objects to simplify scripting, and extending built-in objects. Many scripts are made up of simple lists of instructions. Basically, the browser begins with the first statement after the script tag and follows each instruction in order until it reaches the closing script tag or it encounters an error. Although this is a straightforward approach for short scripts, it can be confusing to read a longer script written this way. To make it easier for you to organize your scripts, we will now discuss how to define and use functions. Functions are groups of JavaScript statements that can be treated as a single unit. To use a function, you must first define it. Here is a simple example of a function definition. This defines a function that displays an alert message to the user. This begins with the function keyword. The function's name is greet. Note the parentheses after the function's name. As you'll learn next, the space between them is not always empty. The first and last lines of the function definition include braces. You use these to enclose all of the statements in the function. The browser uses the braces to determine where the function begins and ends. Between the braces, this particular function contains a single line. This uses the built-in alert function, which displays an alert message. The message will contain the text greetings. Now, about those parentheses, the current greet function always does the same thing. Each time you use it, it displays the same message. Although this avoids a bit of typing, it doesn't really provide much of an advantage. To make your function more flexible, you can add parameters, also known as arguments. These are variables that are received by the function each time it is called. For example, you can add a parameter called who that tells the function the name of the person to greet. Here is the modified greet function. Of course, to use this function, you should include it in an HTML document. Traditionally, the best place for a function definition is within the head section of the document. Because the statements in the head section are executed first, this ensures that the function is defined before it is used. This list shows the greet function embedded in the header section of an HTML document. You have now defined a function and placed it in an HTML document. However, when you load the previous code into a browser, you'll find that it does absolutely nothing. This is because the function is defined and ready to be used, but we just haven't used it yet. Making use of a function is referred to as calling the function. To call a function, use the function's name as a statement in a script. You will need to include the parentheses and the values for the function's parameters. For example, here's a statement that calls the greet function. This tells the JavaScript interpreter to transfer control to the first statement in the greet function. It also passes the parameter Fred to the function. This value will be assigned to the who variable inside the function. This listing shows a complete HTML document that includes the function definition and a second script in the body of the page that actually calls the function. To demonstrate the usefulness of functions, we'll call it twice to greet two different people. This listing includes a second set of script tags in the body of the page. The second script includes two function calls to the greet function, each with a different name. This is an example of a script that actually does something. This shows what it looks like after being loaded into the browser. The function that we just created displays a message to the user, but functions can also return a value to the script that called them. This allows you to use functions to calculate values. As an example, you can create a function that averages 4 numbers. Your function should begin with the function keyword, the function's name, and the parameters it accepts. We will use the variable names a, b, c, and d for the 4 numbers to average. Here is the first line of the function. Next, the function needs to calculate the average of the 4 parameters. You can calculate this by adding them and then dividing by the number of parameters, in this case 4. Thus, here is the next line of the function. This statement creates a variable called result and calculates the result by adding the 4 numbers and then dividing by 4. In this case, the parentheses are necessary to tell JavaScript to perform the addition before the division. To send this result back to the script that called the function, you use the return keyword. Here is the last part of the function. This list shows the complete average function in an HTML document. This HTML document also includes a small script in the body section that calls the average function and displays the result. You can use a variable with the function call as shown in this example. This statement averages the numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6 and stores the result in a variable called score. JavaScript also supports objects, a more complex kind of variable that can store multiple data items and functions. Although a variable can have only one value at a time, an object can contain multiple values as well as functions for working with the values. This allows you to group related data items and the functions that deal with them into a single object. In this lesson, you'll learn how to define and use your own objects. DOM objects, which allow your scripts to interact with web pages, and built-in objects, which include strings and arrays. The syntax for working with all three types of objects, DOM objects, built-in objects, and custom objects, is the same. So even if you don't end up creating your own objects, you should have a good understanding of JavaScript's object terminology and syntax. Let's start with this JavaScript statement. The new keyword tells the JavaScript interpreter to use a function, in this case the built-in array function, to create an object. Each object has one or more properties, essentially variables that will be stored within the object. For example, the location.href property gives you the URL of the current document. The href property is one of the properties of the location object in the DOM. Another example is the length property of string objects as shown in this example. Like variables, each object property has a value. To read a property's value, you simply include the object name and property name, separated by a period, in any expression, just like in the test.length example. You can change a property's value using the equals operator, just like a variable. This example sends the browser to a new URL by changing the location.href property. Along with properties, each object can have one or more methods. These are functions that work with the object's data. For example, this JavaScript statement reloads the current document. When you use reload, you're using a method of the location object. Like normal functions, methods can accept arguments in parentheses and can return values. Although JavaScript's variables and arrays are versatile ways to store data, sometimes you need a more complicated structure. For example, suppose you are creating a script to work with a business card database that contains names, addresses, and phone numbers for a variety of people. If you were using regular variables, you would need several separate variables for each person in the database, a name variable, an address variable, and so on. This would be very confusing. Arrays would improve things slightly. You could have a names array, an addresses array, and a phone number array. Each person in the database would have an entry in each array. This would be more convenient, but still not perfect. With objects, you can make the variables that store the database as logical as business cards. Each person is represented by a card object, which has properties for name, address, and phone number. You can even add methods to the object to display or work with the information. Coming up, you'll see how to use JavaScript to actually create the card object and its properties and methods. Later on, you'll see how to use the card object in a script to display information for several members of the database. The first step in creating an object is to name it and its properties. We've already decided to call the object a card object. Each object will have the following properties. The first step in using this object in a JavaScript program is to create a function to make new card objects. This function is called the constructor for an object. Here is the constructor function for the card object. The constructor is a simple function that accepts parameters to initialize a new object and assigns them to the corresponding properties. This function accepts several parameters from the statement that calls the function and then assigns them as properties of an object. Because the function is called card, the object is the card object. Notice the this keyword. You'll use it any time you create an object definition. Use this to refer to the current object, the one that is being created by the function. Next, we will talk about how to create a method to work with the card object. Because all card objects will have the same properties, it might be handy to have a function that prints out the properties in a neat format. Let's call this function printCard. Your print card function will be used as a method for card objects, so you don't need to ask for parameters. Instead, you can use the this keyword again to refer to the current object's properties. Here is a function definition for the print card function. This function simply reads the properties from the current object, prints each one with a caption, and skips to a new line. You now have a function that prints a card, but it isn't officially a method of the card object. The last thing you need to do is make print card part of the function definition for card objects. Here is the modified function definition. The added statement looks just like another property definition, but it refers to the print card function. This will work so long as the print card function is defined with its own function definition. Methods are essentially properties that define a function rather than a simple value. Now, let's use the object definition and method you just created. To use an object definition, you create a new object. This is done with the new keyword. This statement creates a new card object called Tom. As you can see, creating an object is easy. All you do is call the card function or object definition and give it the required attributes in the same order as the definition. After this statement executes, a new object is created to hold Tom's information. This is called an instance of the card object. Just as there can be several string variables in a program, there can be several instances of an object you define. Rather than specify all the information for a card with the new keyword, you can assign them after the fact. For example, this script creates an empty card object called Holmes and then assigns its properties. After you've created an instance of the card object using either of these methods, you can use the print card method to display its information. For example, this statement displays the properties of the Tom card. JavaScript includes a feature that enables you to extend the definitions of built-in objects. For example, if you think the string object doesn't quite fit your needs, you can extend it, adding a new property or method. This might be very useful if you were creating a large script that used many strings. You can add both properties and methods to an existing object by using the prototype keyword. A prototype is another name for an object's definition or constructor function. The prototype keyword enables you to change the definition of an object outside its constructor function. As an example, let's add a method to the string object definition. You will create a method called heading, which converts a string into an HTML heading. This statement defines a string called title. This statement would output the contents of the title string as an HTML level 1 header. This list adds a heading method to the string object definition that will display the string as a heading and then displays 3 headings using the method. First, you define the addHead function, which will serve as the new string method. It accepts a number to specify the heading level. The start and stop variables are used to store the HTML begin header and end header tags, such as open h1 and close h1. After the function is defined, use the prototype keyword to add it as a method of the string object. You can then use this method on any string object or, in fact, any JavaScript string. This is demonstrated by the last 3 statements, which display quoted text strings as level 1, 2, and 3 headers. Now you've seen how to create a new object to store business cards and a method to print them out. As a final demonstration of objects, properties, functions, and methods, you will now see how to use this object in a web page to display data for several cards. Your script will need to include the function definition for print card, along with the function definition for the card object. You can then create 3 cards and print them out in the body of the document. We will use separate HTML and JavaScript files for this example. Listing 7.5 shows the complete script. Notice that the print card function has been modified slightly to make things look good with the captions in boldface. To use this script, save it as cardtest.js. Next, you'll need to include the script in a simple HTML document. This listing shows the HTML document for this example. To test the script, save the HTML document in the same directory as the cardtest.js file you created earlier, and then load the HTML document into a browser. The browser's display of this example is shown here. In this lesson, you've looked at 2 important features of JavaScript. First, you learned how to use functions to group JavaScript statements and how to call functions and use the values they return. You also learned about JavaScript's object-oriented features, defining objects with constructor functions, creating object instances, and working with properties, property values, and methods. You can now test your knowledge in the quiz area, access the scripts we learned in the lab, or go through the lesson again. The choice is yours. Thank you for choosing Sam's Teach Yourself.